Hello, this is Brian Auten of Apologetics315. Today I am speaking with Greg Ganssle. Greg is a philosopher with the Rivendell Institute and a lecturer in the philosophy department at Yale University. His published works include Thinking About God, First Steps in Philosophy, God and Time, Essays on the Divine Nature, God and Time, Four Views, and A Reasonable God, Engaging the New Face of Atheism. My goal in this interview is to explore a bit more about philosophy of religion, its value to Christians, the impact of the new atheism, and Greg's advice for Christian apologists. Well, thanks for joining me today, Greg.
Sounds great. I'm happy to be here.
Greg, would you mind telling our listeners a bit more about yourself and what you do?
Well, okay. I work for the Rivendell Institute, which is sort of a think tank and ministry center at Yale University. We work with graduate students and faculty mostly, and we concentrate on the intersection of Christian faith and scholarship, how to integrate these things together.
Oh, great. And you're also a lecturer at Yale, is that right?
Yes, I have been. This past year, I wasn't teaching because of budget cuts, but off and on now I'm a lecturer in the philosophy department.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been doing that about 9 years.
Well, I wonder how you came to be a Christian, and then at what point you got interested in philosophy.
Well, I was raised in a family that went to church, and God was important, but like many kids, when I got into high school, God was increasingly irrelevant to the things I cared about. And when I was 16, I had begun going to a youth group with some friends, and over several months, I began to think that God and Jesus were more and more relevant to what I valued and the things that were important to me. And along the way, I had a kind of an epiphany. It hit me that there was too much goodness in the world for it to be an accident. That God had to be real and had to be involved. And that was a big turning point for me. And a couple of weeks later, I was at an evangelistic movie sponsored by Billy Graham, and I went forward and committed my life to Christ.
So this began your journey as a Christian, and I imagine you began thinking deeper and deeper about the big questions in life, and is that how perhaps you got started into the study of philosophy?
Well, I was very slow to begin to study philosophy formally, although I should have known that I was destined to be a philosopher because of, this experience and the kind of music I listened to. I was very enamored with Bob Dylan and Simon and Garfunkel, the very thoughtful lyrics. But I went off to college and didn't take any philosophy and didn't do any work and was a very poor student. But I was involved in campus ministry, and through this I began to read apologetics works. Mm-hmm. And so I did most of my learning outside of the classroom, reading C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer. But it really wasn't until a few years later. After I graduated from college, I joined the staff of Campus Crusade and was working on various campuses. And about 3 or 4 years into this, it dawned on me that I was reading philosophy. And I thought I should take a class to see if I like philosophy. So I took my first intro to philosophy class when I was 25. And I was a campus minister, and I was in the classroom with a bunch of freshmen and sophomores. And that's how I began my education. Working on various campuses, I would take a class here and a class there. And so it was very slow to realize that what I was interested in was philosophy. When I got married, Jeannie and I got married, I was 28, and we moved to Rhode Island, where we worked in ministry at Brown University. And I did my master's degree at the University of Rhode Island part-time. Mm-hmm. And that was the beginning of a plan to study more formally. So over that 5 years, I finished my master's degree and then went to Syracuse full-time to do the PhD. So it took me a long time to realize that philosophy was for me.
Well, what areas have been your key areas of interest and focus?
Well, I do mostly philosophy of religion, analytic philosophy of religion. That's where I do most of my research. The class that I most often taught at Yale was a history of philosophy sequence. And it was a two-part class, Greek and medieval philosophy in the fall and modern philosophy in the spring. So I have a great interest in the history of philosophy as well. But mostly philosophy of religion. I wrote my dissertation on God's relation to time. And, of course, I work on the problem of evil and foreknowledge and free will, all the big questions that your listeners are probably thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, in focusing on analytic philosophy of religion, I wonder how your study has affected your Christian life, if it's been enriching to it and helped you to grow as a Christian.
Well, I think so, yes. I mean, sometimes the puzzles in philosophy get pretty technical and detail-oriented, like any other professional aspect of our lives, and can seem far removed from the vibrant aspect of our faith. But for the most part, there's been quite a convergence. As I have been thinking about the big questions, it's driven me to seek the Lord more and try to figure out how to be a faithful follower of Christ. So I don't think it's been kind of two parallel tracks. There's been much more convergence in terms of what I study and my Christian life. And one big aspect of that is the persistent sense of gratitude I feel that I get to study philosophy. I mean, I consider it a gift and a luxury that I get to spend my time working on these things.
You know, the scripture verse comes to mind that, you know, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but it's the glory of kings to search it out. And when I think of philosophy, sometimes that verse comes to mind where we've been given this privilege to explore God's creation in all its different facets, even in the conceptual and just figuring out and thinking God's thoughts after Him, as it were.
Very much so. That resonates deeply with me. I think throughout the Scriptures, we're invited to use everything that God has given us to explore and to search out what is true about Him, about reality, about human beings. All of this has value because of the good creation, and God made us as knowing beings. I think this is all part of what it means to be made in the image of God. At the same time, we know that we're never going to achieve exhaustive knowledge of God and His purposes, or even of what's true about creation. We're always going to be in a place where our knowledge is inadequate. But I think we're invited to continue to explore.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've asked this next question to a few of my guests, but I'm always interested in their perspectives on it. Some Christians might have an aversion to philosophy. They may or may not cite Scripture, but the general sense that I gather from some is that philosophy is either going to lead you away from God or make your theology go off the rails. That is, if you get too much into philosophy, you're going to take the wrong theological positions because you've been influenced too much by, say, secular views. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a complicated situation, and of course it can be true. I don't think it's a special problem for philosophy. I think anything in our lives can function in a way to drive a wedge between us and both our devotion to Christ and our good thinking about what's revealed in the Scriptures that becomes our theology. So I think anything can be like that. It can be any academic discipline or career, anything that engages our minds in a great deal of hard work, whether it's engineering or medicine or something like that. So I don't think there's a special problem for philosophy. I do think we need to be committed to spending time reflecting on the Scriptures, and the kinds of questions we ask and the kinds of perspectives we bring need to be shaped by the gospel. And that is going to be an important feature of our integration, whether we're philosophers or engineers or lawyers. It's what we learn as we continue to explore the gospel that is going to keep us from allowing these things to become a wedge. I think philosophy brings some skills that actually can be very helpful for our theology.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are skills in terms of making conceptual distinctions that we use all the time in theology, and philosophy helps us become aware of conceptual distinctions, and it trains us to think through them very well. So traditionally, philosophy has been the handmaiden to theology, and people have thought you can't really do theology well without employing philosophical skill and rigor. And I think something like that is true. I wouldn't say that you need to be trained in philosophy to be a good thinker about the Scriptures, but certainly it can help when you come to the Scriptures to have some of these conceptual distinctions in our minds.
You know, you mentioned how anything can become almost, as it were, an idol, or you can put it before God. And I think, well, on the opposite side of that coin, anything that you are willing to submit to God and put under His lordship, He can use in some way, provided, you know, you're doing it within parameters of His will, I suppose.
I think that's exactly right. I think we hold our lives with an open hand before God, and that includes bringing what we have, how He's made us. And some of us are inclined towards philosophy, and it's certainly not for everybody. And I love the scene in the Harry Potter books where they have the sorting hats, and they put on the hat, and it tells them what house they're going to be in. And an undergraduate education is like a sorting hat. It helps you get exposed to things and think, no, philosophy is definitely not for me, but engineering is. And I think, you know, there are plenty of reasons not to go after philosophy, but any of these things, I think, when we bring them to the Lord with an open hand, can be part of how we live out a faithful devotion to Christ, and then how God uses us in the world.
Yeah, I think that's good. Would you say that one cannot avoid doing philosophy? Isn't the, quote, you shouldn't get into philosophy, unquote, actually a philosophy?
Well, I think, yes, to a degree. And, I mean, philosophy is an academic discipline, and you learn stuff like who all these people were, what they said. But when it comes down to living our lives, we all navigate lives with some ideas about how to sort out what's a better life to live and what's not a better life to live, what reality's like and what reality's not like, and how do we even approach these questions. And those are generally philosophical questions. So everybody's got a philosophy of life. Everybody is applying philosophical tools to how they navigate their lives, even if that person is not interested in academic philosophy and doesn't care what Descartes thought or Aquinas. We still navigate our lives this way. And so having some exposure can be really helpful, even to identify what are the questions I'm actually asking myself when I make these decisions. And what am I assuming about what the best life to live is? Even when we read the Scriptures, we're applying philosophical categories to what we're reading, I think. So it's a little bit unavoidable in a way that probably most other disciplines aren't. I mean, everybody does a little bit of history along the way as well, and a little bit of natural science, because we interact with the physical world. But it seems like philosophy is a little more foundational.
Just thinking of philosophy and using the word as maybe a system of thought, does every philosophy have its own truth claims? And if that's true, what are some of the ways that those truth claims can be evaluated?
Well, see, that's a good question. Everybody has a set of truth claims that they assume, and they assume they're true, about very deep questions. What does it mean to be a human being? Are there moral truths? And if so, how do we know what they are? And what is the content of morality, whether God exists or not? And it's puzzling to people because we're used to dealing with truth claims in terms of things that are empirical, things that we can see and test by looking at stuff, or through mathematical analysis, right? We can balance our checkbook. I should say my wife can balance our checkbook. I'm very bad at it. But philosophical methodology is a little bit different. We think about our concepts, and then we try to think, well, if this is true, this particular claim, what else would have to be true? What kind of picture of reality does this claim fit with? So, for example, that there's something special about human beings as opposed to, in comparison to other animals, is a claim that most of us have a hunch that something like that is true. Well, what picture of reality does that fit with best? If it's true, then what does that say about how we treat other animals? Or all of the other questions begin to spin off of that.
Mm-hmm.
And what we do is we think hard about them. We try to be consistent. We try to make clear the implications of certain claims, and we test out these truths in terms of our own experience.
Along that line, I'm thinking of atheism. And when it comes to atheism, about which you've written one of your books recently about the new atheism, are atheists claiming through their atheism that there's no God, or is it just, as some would say, a lack of belief in God? And what's the best way to approach that sort of question of a semantics or a true distinction, or is there a truth claim being made there? How do you sort through that when maybe you've encountered it?
Well, it can be confusing because some atheists are going to claim that atheism is merely the lack of belief in God, but it's not a claim that there is no God. Now, I think some atheists are concerned, and in fact some Christians present this argument. They will say something like, it's hard to be an atheist because God might exist outside of your knowledge. And since you don't know everything, maybe God actually does exist. I think that's a real mistake for Christians to push this line of argument, because it implies that in order to be an atheist, you have to have certainty that God doesn't exist. Whereas I think what it means to be an atheist is simply to think that God doesn't exist. Even if you might say, I could be wrong. Just like to be a theist is to believe that God exists. Even if you think, well, I could be mistaken about the claim. I don't think I am, but I could be. And I think some of the atheists who are pushing this definition of atheism as simply a lack of belief are trying to put themselves in a slightly stronger position so that they don't have to defend a particular claim. They're trying to hide behind the idea that I'm not making any claims, but you, the theist, are the one that's making the claim. And I don't think that's, people can use the word atheism any way they want, but I don't think that's as fruitful, because people who are atheists have views about the nature of reality, and those views don't include the existence of God. Right? So they have to believe that the universe came into existence without God. Whereas a theist believes the universe came into existence with God, or by means of God. So I think I don't think it's actually a fair move on the atheist part. Sometimes I think they take this up because Christians have pushed this other argument that's not very good.
Well, in speaking of philosophy, kind of shifting our gears back again, I'm guessing maybe one of the books you might suggest for doing study in this area would be your own, which I'm happy to promote and endorse here, and that's the one entitled Thinking About God, First Steps in Philosophy. Now, as far as philosophy books go, I think this is just really accessible, easy to read. The concepts are not all easy, but you really make them accessible, and your writing style is really welcoming. But can you talk about your overall goal in writing the book and what audience you hope to reach?
Well, thanks. I'm glad you like it. The book came about in a strange sort of way. I was teaching a philosophy class at a Christian high school where my kids were in school, and I was running out of material. I mean, I taught just one day a week, and so I started teaching through the problem of evil. And each week I would type up notes, and I began to think, this would be really fruitful. So my original target was for high school students. And but since the book's been published, it's been used at least a half a dozen colleges, some Christian colleges and some secular colleges, as intro texts. What I really wanted to do was to write simply and clearly, but without compromising the details of the arguments. And it took a long time because that's quite a challenge. I think I've seen some introductory level books that don't handle the arguments very well in an effort to make them simple. And I kept thinking we've got to be able to do both. Make something really clear, but to pay attention to the details of the argument. And then the other thing I was very interested in was the first section of the book, which is it's really thinking about God. And that's where I talk about faith and reason, things like you can't prove the existence of God, what that means. Because it turns out there's a lot of work we have to do before we can begin to make a case that God exists in order to put our case for the existence of God into a reasonable context. So the way philosophy of religion is often done in the university is you'll spend a couple of days talking about the cosmological argument, and because there's one of the premises that could be doubted, the textbook or the professor will say, therefore it's not a proof, therefore the argument doesn't work. And then you go on to another argument. What I was trying to do is show that, well, even if these arguments aren't proofs, they can present evidence that it makes it likely that God exists. And trying to get out of analyzing arguments for and against the existence of God as proofs, and much more the way a detective solves a mystery. There are pieces of evidence, and evidence points in one direction, other pieces of evidence might point in the other direction, but you're trying to figure out where the total case, the total body of evidence points. And you never get 100% certainty. You will get, hopefully, a pretty strong case. And, of course, I think that's what you can do with the existence of God. So I was really trying to help people not just look at reasons to believe in God, but how we should think about these reasons.
Well, it's definitely a great starting read, I think, and I highly recommend it. And I wonder, Greg, if you could have your way, how would you like to raise the bar, if you will, of Christian thought in general? And that is, are there particular thinking skills, tools, or attitudes that you would want to instill in people to be more thoughtful about their Christian convictions?
Well, that's a very good question, and there's a lot of directions I'm tempted to go. One of the things I would say is I would love to see Christians who are not professional in ministry or in philosophy or in academics or in apologetics, but Christians throughout the church take a lot more initiative in studying the scriptures. I think there are one of the things that has been really fruitful for me personally over the last 10 years is reading commentaries. So in my devotional life, in fact, most of the 10 years I've been doing the Gospels. I will read a paragraph in the Gospel, and then I'll read the commentary paragraph. And I've worked my way through a half a dozen commentaries, probably 3,500 pages worth. And a lot of these commentaries that are being written in the last 20 years are very helpful for helping us dig more deeply into the Scripture without being so technical that you need to be a scholar to read them. So I usually skip the footnotes because I don't read Greek or Hebrew. And but the body of a commentary can really help us engage the Scriptures. I think that if there's a challenge with shallowness among Christians in America, it has a lot more to do with our engagement in the Scriptures and deepening our grasp and inhabiting the Word of God over time. So that would be one line of thought. I think that would probably be my top one, helping believers engage the Scriptures deeply without having it to be academic. I think a lot of Christians think, well, I don't want to get into this because I'm not going to be a Bible scholar, but just continuing to learn more and more, that could be a big help.
Now let's switch audiences to those specifically who would want to be better Christian defenders of the faith. What role do you think philosophical training or study could serve in the broader scope of their overall studies in that field?
Well, I think philosophy can be very helpful for defending the faith. At least a basic understanding of philosophical argument and a basic awareness of the history of philosophy. It's really helpful to have a sketch of the history of philosophy so you recognize ideas. When you hear something, you think, oh, that sounds like Descartes. That sounds like David Hume. And that can help you know how to think more deeply about the question that's in front of you, and sometimes more charitably. As well as some of the things we talked about already about making conceptual distinctions and learning how to ask questions of the ideas that are in front of us, know what kinds of questions are going to be fruitful. So I think philosophy can be very helpful. Now, I think if someone is starting out and interested in becoming increasingly competent as an apologist to defend the faith, I think one of the things that can be helpful is for that person to figure out which aspect of the case for Christianity do they gravitate towards, because some people are going to be built to engage in the philosophical discussions. Others are going to be much more interested in the historical issues, for example, surrounding the historical Jesus or the resurrection, or maybe Old Testament history. And others are going to be much more interested in things like science and religion, or sociological studies on the effects of religion in society. So there are lots of, in a sense, locations where there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of work being done. And I think people should find the spot that they love, find the spot that excites them, and spend more of their time there. I love the image from the Gospel of Luke where Jesus says, no one putting his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God. Sometimes I use that image and think, we want to find our plow and put our hand on it. And for some people it'll be philosophy. For some people it'll be historical apologetics. Some people it's going to be, how religious beliefs affect society. I mean, there are all kinds of locations. So not to be afraid to become a specialist and to gravitate towards what you love, knowing that other people are going to go in other places, and you can read their books. I just read Mike Lacona's book on the resurrection of Jesus, a historiographical approach, which is about 700 pages, and it's not so scholarly because I don't know anything about his historical method. It's not difficult, but it's incredibly thorough and charitable, and it's going to be the first place you go for historical apologetics. It's just a wonderful work. Well, as a philosopher, I'm really glad to have Mike doing that apologetic, and I can draw on that when I need to, but he can spend his life doing it.
Well, I really like what you've said there about, going with your strengths and for the things that you gravitate towards. Because I think, as you're kind of describing, you can easily get turned off by something that you just don't, maybe you're not wired for, so to speak. And,
right.
What you were saying there about, looking at the history of philosophy, you kind of realize that there's nothing new under the sun. And, being able to survey that landscape makes you familiar with these different trains of thought and how they've been dealt with by thinkers of the past. I wonder also what you would want to say about learning these tools that you referred to earlier about, even understanding structures of arguments and how to determine if there's a fallacy or if someone is reasoning properly or well.
Yes, I think this can be very helpful. And there are really three parts to thinking about this. One is what you would call formal logic, and that's where you translate arguments into symbols and you learn symbolic logic, which can be really fun and really interesting. Then there's informal logic, and that has to do with identifying different kinds of fallacies, things like non sequitur, when something actually doesn't follow, but it sounds like it follows, or this person is appealing to authority in a way that's illegitimate. It's kind of like when you have a football player trying to sell you a computer, and you think, well, this guy's really good at blocking for a running back, but does that mean he knows what the best computer is? So the informal logic can be very helpful. But then there's another field, and I'm not sure if we should call it rhetoric or persuasion or something like this. And I think we could pay attention to what is it that is persuasive to a person. And a lot of that has to do with what is it that this person I'm in a conversation with cares about in this conversation. What's at stake for this person? And learning how to discern what's important to a person with whom you're having a conversation can help you not make certain blunders, not be insensitive, but also to think in terms of, well, how does Christianity connect with the things that are important? I mean, if the gospel is true, then the gospel captures the deepest desires and needs and fears and longings of every human being. And the more we can listen to people and think about, how would the gospel take up the very concerns this person has. So I'm not sure what to call that skill. Sometimes I use the word becoming a diagnostician, like a doctor. So you can think about the doctor image. So a doctor goes to medical school for 4 years, which is very grueling. Then the doctor spends 6 years in rotations, and when the doctor is finished with all that, she knows all kinds of technical knowledge about diseases. But then when you go to the doctor, what does she do? She asks you, how are you feeling? And she listens to you. And she learns how to think, okay, given what you're saying, and then what I can observe with my stethoscope and things like this, I think this is what's going on. The doctor, you don't go to the doctor's office and she doesn't give you a big lecture on the history of viruses or something. That would be very, it might be interesting. I was going to say that might be boring, but it could be interesting as well. But no, the doctor listens. And so I think the listening skill is something that apologists really want to cultivate.
Well, I think that's a powerful illustration and brings to my mind, the idea that, so much of this learning that we may be doing as Christian thinkers is much of it's going to be resting under the surface, and the real wisdom behind someone maybe not how much they say, but what they don't say, and bringing out just the right words, a word in season, having that discernment, as you say, to be able to know how to connect that person with Christ.
It helps us to think there are really 3 aspects to thinking about apologetics. One of them is theological, and not many people write on this. John Frame has written on this. Questions like, given what we know about the fall from Scripture, how much common ground should we expect with unbelievers? Like, there's a theological exploration into the foundations of defending the gospel. The most common aspect is what we could call discipline-specific or academic apologetics, and that's where we learn the arguments, right? And so we read books on arguments for the existence of God, or the historicity of the resurrection, and that's very technical, and it's important. But the third aspect is the evangelism aspect, and that's how do we make the connection, like you say, between Christ and the individual person. And that's where we need our diagnostics and our understanding of persuasion. We want, as you said, under the surface, to have a good understanding of the issues, because that's going to help us maybe figure out how to deliver some helpful material for somebody. But if you're in an individual conversation, you know how it goes. You can't get very technical in a conversation, because conversations go everywhere. Right? The most you can do sometimes is offer a person an article to read, or make a few suggestions. This is why when we work with students, we'll say, you want a 30-second answer to all the big questions, and then you want a 2-minute answer to all the big questions. Because that's about all you get in a conversation. And then maybe you can go a little bit farther. So I think sometimes in the apologetics world, we don't see the evangelism end of it. And as a result, we aren't thinking in terms of, okay, how do I kind of diagnose what's really operating in this person's life that are raising obstacles to their coming to Christ.
Well, we talked about one of your books that I really recommend, and another one that you have written engages with the new atheists and their arguments. We don't have a lot of time to explore it at this time, but it's called A Reasonable God, Engaging the New Faith of Atheism. And I wonder, from your perspective, do you think that the new atheism has done more help than harm to Christianity in, say, the grand scheme of things? Obviously, they've done harm, but I'm wondering if down the road we would look back and say, it's really helped things, maybe strengthened the church in the long run. And also along that line, how significant would you say that their influence has been overall?
Well, that's a really good question, and I think time will tell. There are some very helpful things that have come out of the new atheists. One is that the public conversation about the reality of God has been placed before us in a way that we could never do, right? So that in a sense, that a new conversation started, and because the atheists started it, we have a lot more opportunities, and that's pretty dramatic. And part of that's because the main leadership in the new atheist movement, if we could call it that, are public intellectuals. So it's become a public conversation in a way that 10 years ago it wasn't, the reality of God. And I think that's a big help. As far as harm is concerned, I think there's going to be a lot of people whose hunch that Christianity is intellectually suspect is going to be strengthened. Not necessarily by, well, some of them by reading the New Atheists, but others just by kind of overhearing the discussion. And that, I'm not sure which of these trends is going to counterbalance the other one. But I think that's going to be the long-term major impact of the new atheists in terms of pushing people away from Christ, is going to be reiterating or strengthening this vague assumption that so many people have that, well, there's something, crazy about believing in God.
Well, let's suppose it's years from now and the quote-unquote dust has settled from the new atheism's spike in popularity. Just imagining here. What I'm getting at is, down the line, what do you think are particular arguments or a lasting impact that will continue to be felt? Have there been any particular arguments that they've brought to the table that, wow, that's really significant and that's going to really be around for a while?
Well, I think there is one that they have brought. It had been around before, but they have brought to the front in a way that's going to be with us a while. And that is, and this comes from Hitchens' book, even the title, is belief in God good for the world or good for the person doing the believing? And that's not a brand new worry, but I think that worry is going to be with us a while because there's been kind of some underlying worry about this, but the new atheists have crystallized that challenge. And I think there's a lot of people working on it. I mean, there's a lot of work being done on actual sociological studies about who are the people that give the most, right? And who are the people that sacrifice the most to help other people. And I think that's going to be with us a while. Incidentally, it's not one of the questions I took up in my book, right? I took up the philosophical case for atheism that they presented. So I'm not. I didn't make any contribution to this, but I recognize. I think this is going to be one of the lasting things.
Sort of maybe an emotional dent or a perception that may last for a while, huh?
Yes, and it's very important, even though it is emotional, because it helps people not want to believe in God. And if someone doesn't want to be a theist or a Christian, it's much harder for that person to engage and see any plausibility in in the case for Christianity. Whereas if people want Christianity to be true, so I think the next great apologetic would be this. Today, many people believe the following. They think, I'm pretty sure Christianity is not true, and it's a good thing. Wouldn't it be great if they thought, I wish it were true? Right? So if we could influence people to begin to wish that Christianity was true, that would be a very powerful apologetic. Because then our reasons for believing in God are going to find fertile soil. They're going to be ready and much more open to engage with the gospel. And I think that is something that we need to be working on for the next 50 years.
Well, it brings to mind a quote from Blaise Pascal. He said, men despise religion, they hate it, and are afraid that it may be true. The cure for this is to show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. Next, make it attractive, make good men wish it were true, and then show that it is. And I think that rings true to your suggestion there.
Yes, that's exactly what we're talking about.
Well, one of the goals of Apologetics 315 and this podcast is to equip the next generation of Christian apologists. So if you had just one more lecture to give, and it was to a room full of Christian defenders, what would your advice be to them?
That's a great question. And first, let me say I'm glad that's your goal, right? We have to continue to invest in raising up the next generations of Christian defenders and scholars. I think, I don't know exactly how I would frame it, but I would want to talk about humility and charity. I think it's too easy for us to respond with the same kind of dismissiveness that we read about in some of the new atheists and the atheist bloggers and people like this, and detrimental to everything we want to be and to do. I think it's critical for the next generation of apologists to be listeners, to be humble, not to exaggerate the strength of our case, not to assume that atheists are stupid, but to recognize the complexities of belief formation and engage with charity. I mean, this is what I tried to do in my book on the new atheist. I thought there's already a lot of shrill response, and I thought, let's try to engage them, respect them enough to take their argument seriously, and engage them charitably, find common ground, try to analyze what they're saying, take the time to understand really what's going on, and then bring a response to bear. So I guess I would be most interested in trying to help the next generation pursue their engagement with unbelievers with a great deal of humility and charity, and to eschew any culture war mentality, us versus them. It's a tall order. I think we're trained, especially in the internet engagement world, to be to look for zingers, right? And let's not do that. That's not what Jesus wants us to do, and that's not what it means to be a human being. It's not what it means to love our neighbors as ourselves.
I think that's great. In your view, what would you say are the must-study areas in Christian apologetics?
Well, I would think the gospel. The question, what is the gospel in its breadth and fullness and thickness is the must-study area. It's interesting. When we started the Rivendell Institute, we're about to start our 17th year. One of the things we did early on was we thought, what are the primary obstacles to the gospel in the realm of ideas, and how can we engage these? And, of course, naturalism came up, and postmodernism, and skepticism about the historical Jesus. Those were the three things we thought. These are the ones that are really operative. So we spent some time working on these things. And our study of postmodernism was interesting. After about 5 or 6 years, we realized it's not that big a deal. And we began to have the conviction that it's better to study the gospel and to figure out how is it that the gospel connects. It's not a question of, one of my colleagues says it this way, it's not a question of making the gospel relevant as discovering and showing its intrinsic relevance. Our conviction is that the resources to connect the gospel with an individual and a culture are found mostly in the gospel itself. But normally, we in evangelicalism have a thin understanding of the gospel, in the sense that we focus on the core of it, which of course is essential, and that's why it's the core, which is the atonement, which is forgiveness. But throughout the scriptures, we see that forgiveness is central, but not the whole of what God is doing in the gospel. So one of the stunning things to me, now this is turning into a long answer, I'm sorry, was that in the Gospel of John, the English word forgive and forgiveness is found only in one verse. But almost every time Jesus talks about what he is about, he uses the word life. And it's over 30 times. And, of course, some of our favorite verses come from this. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I came that they might have life. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the bread of life. Over and over again. So we began to think, if the gospel is a gospel of life, how does it display itself this way? And then how can we help build the bridge so people see it as a gospel of life? So this connects with some of the things we were talking about before. I think in apologetics, we can think we have got to pave this road, and then at the end we give them a little gospel nugget, and we've done all this work, and then the gospel nugget can take root. But I think the more we study the scriptures, we see that it's the gospel that paves the road, right? And it's not that we don't want to engage in arguments. Of course we do. But we're always looking for how is it that what Jesus did, how does that take up the concerns of this person? And how can I help the person recognize that that's the case? So the more we can have a deeper and a thicker and a broader experience and sense of what the gospel is, I think the more effective we're going to be in placing the other things we do as apologists in a context that they can be most helpful.
Well, one thing that I alluded to in talking about your book, Thinking About God, is that you make it accessible, and you use simple sentences to unfold ideas clearly in an understandable way. Now, when it comes to speaking to people regarding various complex issues, the Christian faces some of the same challenges. The common pitfall might be to overcomplicate things with the person to whom we're speaking. So, in your view, as a communicator, how can the Christian learn to communicate their ideas simply and clearly with their audience?
That's a fantastic question, and it can be very difficult. And here's one of the problems. I've talked a lot about connecting with an individual, but when you're giving a talk, you've got maybe 50 individuals. And it's impossible to diagnose each one individually. when you're talking about a topic, I mean, I think when you have an opportunity to give a lecture, say on a campus, these are places where what we call traditional apologetics can work really well for us. So I speak a lot I have a talk on faith, reason, and the knowledge of God, and the problem of evil. I did one on religion and science this spring. And, the religion and science talk, it was at the University of Massachusetts, was a case in point. After I was done, I realized that for some of the audience, it was too complicated. But for the ones who had really thought about it, it was too basic. And that is the challenge you're always trying to skirt. You don't want to lose a bunch of the audience because you're being too technical, but then you don't want someone to think, well, you barely touched the issue. I don't have any secret on how to do that, except to ask the question, if I was walking in, or if I was a non-Christian and I was invited by one of my friends and I kind of don't want to be here, what would be my hunch about this subject matter? And then I would try to work my talk to capture that hunch. That's the audience I'm going for, is the person that kind of doesn't want to be there, that's not a philosophy professor, but is thoughtful and is, pretty sure religion and science are incompatible. To try to go after that. I think the most important part of a speaking engagement is the question and answer part. And I always insist on doing a Q&A because that's where you can address things more particularly. So if someone asks a question and it gets a little bit technical, you can say, okay, in order to answer that question, I'm going to have to get a little technical here. We're going to have to talk about some metaphysics, and the audiences tend to be very charitable when you do that. And it's also a place where you can talk about the gospel and theology. So sometimes I'll say, well, in order to answer that question, I'm going to have to get a little theological here. And so this is how it goes, and I might talk about creation and the fall or something like that. But it's very challenging to skirt between these kinds of things. I think the best way to start, though, is to be a little more basic than you think you should be, and then you judge by the Q&A whether you really needed to engage a little more deeply. And you might find you don't. The talk I give on faith and reason basically comes out of the first section of thinking about God. And it's very basic. But it tends to engage people in conversations. When I do the problem of evil, it's more technical, and I actually give a handout that has the arguments, because I'm walking through John Mackey's argument that there's a contradiction and Bill Rowe's argument about the evidential argument. And if you've got something a little technical, it's helpful to have a handout where not that they have to take notes, but they can follow your argument. A lot of people use PowerPoint, but I'm not very savvy about stuff like that. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I can see some of the ideas that you've talked about there. I'm just imagining, well, would that work for me? And what you were saying sounded really applicable. The part about being more basic than you think you may need to be, or choosing that particular audience member to kind of gear the perspective of your talk to. I do think that's good advice. Now, Greg, we're running low on time.
Okay.
But one thing I wanted to make sure you were able to talk about is the Rivendell Institute. I'm wondering if you could tell our listeners a little bit more about Rivendell.
We named it Rivendell because in The Lord of the Rings, now this was before the movies came out, right? In The Lord of the Rings, Rivendell was a place where everything about culture flourished. poetry, songs, dining, and it's also the place from which they launched the campaign. So we like that evocative feel. And we launched Rivendell because we were interested in figuring out what it would take to make a difference in the university long term. And we had some commitments that we thought we need to have these features. One was longevity. We thought it's going to take a long time to make a difference. So we all made 20-year commitments. Another one is academic engagement, because the university is an academic place. We didn't want to do campus ministry in a way that ignored that. And then strategic presence. We thought our goal is to see to the degree that we can become insiders in a university so that the gospel comes from within rather than from without. And this is very relational, so we spent a lot of time selling to relationships with faculty and graduate students. So the short story is a bunch of us felt the need to plant at one university and invest, the bulk of our lives in seeing what could happen there. And that's what we've been doing. We're beginning to experience the benefits of our longevity. We have a lot of relational capital with key faculty and administrators. Because we had a long-term horizon, we were very patient about the kinds of things we did. We weren't trying to get a quick win. So we sponsor lots of lectures and discussion groups. We do a lot of seminars for grad students and faculty on, integrating Christian faith and theology with the academic enterprise. We do a lot of personal mentoring with grad students. We act as advisors to some of the small groups that are at, like, the divinity school or the business school or the law school. We're informally involved in helping them think through how to engage their particular audiences. So anyway, that's kind of the smorgasbord. But people can look at our website, which is under construction, but it'll be up in a month, RivendellInstitute.org, and get a sense of what we're about. But it's our home soil is the work at Yale University, even though some of us dabble in things outside of New Haven. Our main thing is at Yale.
Well, excellent. I'll point our listeners there at the blog post, and we wish you all the best in that endeavor as it continues.
Thanks.
Greg, I've really enjoyed our interview, and I want to thank you for being my guest today.
Well, thanks, Brian. I appreciate your work.
I have been speaking with Greg Ganssle, philosopher with the Rivendell Institute and a lecturer in the philosophy department at Yale University. Links to all of his books can be found at today's blog post at Apologetics315, and particularly his accessible introduction to philosophy, Thinking About God. One thing that helps get the word out about resources like this interview is your help by sending links, tweets, and Facebook updates to your friends on the web. If you found this resource helpful, please take a few seconds to share it, because you never know who you might benefit. And I also encourage you to be a friend on Facebook or Twitter for more daily links to some of the best resources and articles in Christian apologetics. If you're listening to this audio and are not subscribed to the Apologetics 315 interviews, check them out in iTunes or the RSS feed. Just type in Apologetics 315 into the search bar for this podcast, and others from Apologetics 315 will also come up. Podcast episodes are released in advance of their blog posting, so you should consider subscribing. This is Brian Auden of Apologetics 315, and thanks for listening.